dum, 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 dum. What is it good for? Anyway, yeah, last time we were talking all about how war was so different for these people because of how overall they could just range and ride and become these, well, the great hordes of the Central Asia, the Khans of the steppe. They had vast empires, and that even though that they were builders in many senses, they also were just roving giant armies, and they would draw away from each other. And just how different a mode of war was, because it really was often between kings a rivalry and a revenge kind of story, which we view, well, depending on where you are. I mean, there are still some stories where the big bad evil guy is really against and wants to fight the good guy, one-on-one combat at the very end, even though there's big armies fighting all around. There are still stories that are like that, but more often, in reality, we now see the leaders of governments sitting back while their armies fight. So, just how different it is. Now, let's continue on with the wars, because that's a lot of what the Jaredites have in their history in the Book of Ether. This section 2 is Wars of Extermination. Both Shiz and Coriantumr, as they moved about on their endless campaigns, swept off the inhabitants before them, all they that would not join them. That's Ether 14:17. This is the classic Asiatic method of force recruiting. If the neighboring province to that which they invade will not aid them, says an eyewitness of the Tartar technique, they waste it, and with the inhabitants whom they take with them, they proceed to fight against the other province. They place their captives in front of the battle, and if they fight not courageously, put them to the sword. In such a way, the Asiatic warlords from the beginning swept the earth before them like Shiz. Ether, I think, 14:18. And like the communist hordes of our day, remember, this was a product of 1953, like the communist hordes of our day, forcing all that lay in their path to become part of them. I counted them among my people, says the Assyrian conqueror of one nation after another. And this ancient formula would seem to go back to our friend Nimrod, whom popular superstitions saw reincarnated as Genghis Khan, as he become a mighty hunter, according to Carpini in chapter 6 of Carpini's book, whatever that is. Carpini, chapter 16, in Komroff. See what I mean? He learned to steal men and to take them for prey. He ranged on the other countries, taking as many captives as he could and joining them to himself, as Nimrod had done by awful oaths. This system of sweeping the earth explains how it was possible for small and obscure Asiatic tribes to rise very quickly to be conquerors of all Asia and most of Europe. The tribe that gave its name to conquering hordes was merely the nucleus of an army which snowballed into a world army of forced recruiting of all it met. Frankly, I'm also sitting here thinking, okay, so if you are a warrior-like nucleus family that wants to conquer the world, right? And you're doing this, you're really skilled and ruthless and good at managing. It's just the way it is. But what does this mean for the regular populace? And that's actually a good kind of question, because think about it. If you are forced to be at the front lines in the next battle whenever you're swept up by the next army that picks you up, so you can prove that you're useful, I would think this means that as a just general population, you have to teach yourself and your children to be good warriors, so that way, no matter what army comes along, you're prepared. And so it kind of just, it binds the whole culture to the idea of you must be prepared for war and warlike things. You don't get to have a surplus civilian population that gets to sit back and do whatever. No, you're on the front lines. I wonder if there is an exception, because they talked about them being city builders too. So if you're not building a city, you're fighting. When 90% of most cultures and civilizations were agrarian, I would assume that would mean that not only were you always a farmer and rancher and, home factory, you were also a warrior in all your respective duties as a person in these ancient times. A great deal has been written about the calculated Schrecklichkeit. Let me try that again. SCH Schrecklichkeit of the great conquerors. That's a new word. Schrecklichkeit. Yeah, that's probably the best I'm going to get. Is Schrecklichkeit of the great, unless I don't know the accent of certain vowels and consonants next to each other, unless I know the root of, is this German, or is this maybe Oriental, or whatever else. Schrecklichkeit, I would think, is German-ish, and that's the best I could do, unless there's certain pronunciations of letters next to each other I'm unfamiliar with. So, sorry. A great deal has been written about the calculated Schrecklichkeit of the great conquerors, especially Genghis Khan, those whose practices have been condoned by recent biographers on the grounds that there is no better weapon than terror to soften up opposition, provoke early surrender, and thus save lives. This is true. I mean, if you look at the pirates during the golden age of the pirates, they often didn't want to actually kill people. They wanted to terrorize them. And the reason this is important is because, again, not only does it save lives, you get the booty on the high seas that you can then go and sell in your local market that turns the blind eye, because you get a cut, and they get a cut, and they get cheaper goods. So piracy, that's kind of what made the whole piracy thing work. But when they had to be more forceful, and they started being more forceful, and the more that they took lives, then you had the pirate hunters come. Because no longer was it just terror and early surrender that saved lives. No, if you are actually out there committing atrocities and killing people, like the dread pirate Roberts that takes no survivors, he would have been hunted down and killed. There would not be a dread pirate Roberts, especially if the rumor was that he took no prisoners. Because, again, you terrorize them, but you actually start killing people, you will have people who are like, no, we're not putting up with this. We're going to put you down like a dog. And that's what ended, among several other pressures, that's what started putting an end to the pirate reign. Anyway, and so Genghis Khan was apparently basically doing the same thing. Run up, terrorize, and save lives. That means that you can join the horde and terrorize the next group. Certainly terror is a keynote of the Asiatic warfare, with its absolute contempt for human life. Well, that seems to be antithetical to what I was just saying. You terrorize someone, but you have an absolute contempt for human life? Then you would have no problem killing others. But let's continue and say, the boast of the Assyrian king might be echoed by many ancient and modern successor. I marched victoriously like a mad dog, spreading terror, and I met no conqueror. Being a mad dog seems to us a poor thing to boast of, but terror was clearly calculated. Shiz would have understood, as in his pursuit of Coriantumr, he did slay both women and children, and he did burn through the cities thereof. And there went a fear of Shiz throughout all the land. Yea, a cry went forth throughout the land. Who can stand before the army of Shiz? Behold, he sweepeth the earth before him. When Korihor gained a victory, it was his turn to be terror of the earth, and the people began to be frightened and began to flee before the armies of Coriantumr. So I guess this is an opposite of what I was thinking. It was not like the early pirates. It was like the later pirates, ones where terror through death and horror. But this is Shiz and Coriantumr, which leads to the absolute destruction, the wars of extermination. So I think that would be what they are looking for. Yeah, it's to cause terror, but it's not just to cause terror to save lives. No, this is terror of death and genocide. An important byproduct of the Asiatic Jaredite system of rallying armies and absorbing nations is the efflorescence of robber bands on the face of the land. All who will not join the great armies are put to death, as we have seen. But what of those who escape? They are naturally outlaws, having no allegiance to any king, hence no rights or claims to protection. To survive, these people band themselves together, and since all are deserters whose heads are forfeit, their behavior becomes very dangerous. Asia has at all times swarmed with robber bands, exactly as did this continent under the Jaredites. Ooh, sorry, I just had a crazy thought. Sorry, the reason I have this as a crazy thought is I'm thinking of second coming type thoughts, where people's hearts will fail them, that, violence is abroad in all the land. Other tidbits about, if you did not want to take up swords against your neighbor, then you would have to flee to Zion. And I was just sitting there thinking, what if that's kind of the eventual way of things? That we revert to these Jaredite type-like warfare bands where people start sweeping across the country, taking everyone and everything with them. And if you don't want to be a part of either one, you have to stand aloof. And if you stand aloof from them, you're like these robber bands. And these robber bands know that if anyone captures them, they're going to be killed. And so they become very dangerous themselves. But what if instead of being a robber band, they are a righteous band? And everyone who will not fight with either one of these roving warriors or bands or people, if they stand aloof enough and away from these fighting bands and become a Zion-like people, you're no longer, you've crushed the remnants of regular civilization. But imagine a third-party robber band, in this case, but instead of it being a robber band is Zion, that refuses to join either side to start killing their neighbor. But no one dares go up against them, because if they do, they know they're toast, because there's enough people in the Zion's camp that will defend themselves, that it's like useless to go after them. I don't know. Like I said, crazy thought. No idea how it applies, but there's something for you. Asia has at all times swarmed with robber bands, exactly as this continent under the Jaredites, from the time these robber bands have formed coalitions strong enough to ruin states and overturn thrones. Sorry, I was just making sure I didn't skip anything. After wars between the Mongols and the Mamluks had exhausted all their resources and brought ruin to many lands, soldiers from both sides banded together in robber armies, gathered up the outcasts in the deserts and mountains, and came near to conquering all of Western Asia. The pages of Bar Hebraeus swarm with these robber bands, and good descriptions of how they operate. Whenever central governments became weakened by wars and corruption, bands of robbers would appear as if out of the earth, as when early in the 19th century, the robber Omar became the terror of all the Near East, and joining forces with the robber chief Nasir in the north, began to destroy the world. Whew. Nope, nothing in the footnotes. Just as robber bands often formed the nucleus of world-conquering armies, some Chinese emperors had whole armies composed of bad young men. So those world armies, once beaten, promptly broke up into robber bands again, while their leader, lately a world ruler, would find himself again nothing but a bandit chief. The years during which, there's a footnote for this one that looks like it has information. It says, this is well nigh the leitmotif, so what I would call motif, but apparently leitmotif, of Arabish's Life of Timur, Kitab Ajaib al-Makdur, etc. I guess those are the authors. This is a Cairo book from 1335. Wow. Princes then defeated regularly become highway robbers, according to the Chinese annals Kraus Cygnus Han. Attila's descendants became leaders of robber bands, though heirs to the world empire. Jornanus Belgoth, chapter 58, that this is the primordial state of things appears from Darmester. So they're basically pointing out in all these different books that, look, after you go running around and conquering everything, sometimes after things start to break up, you're just back to the head of a leader of robbers. That's it. There's your rise and fall of these great armies. The years during which the Justinian and Chosroes were locked in a deadly rivalry for the rule of the world saw the rise in Western Asia of a motley array of robber gangs numbering 12,000 men, who brought complete ruin upon a large part of the civilized world. In this time of panic, and insecurity, great schism fell upon the Arabs, i.e. the inhabitants, and in every quarter a man rose up who did not agree with his companion. This typical and recruitment state of things vividly recalls the awful days of the Jaredite robbers, when every man slept on his sword to guard his property from every other man, and still had it stolen. Same thing happens with the Nephites too, by the way. We need not dwell on the pathological aspects of the Asiatic warfare, the hideous disguises, the bloody oaths, the insane yells, the pyramids of heads, and all that. In Teres Boba, Gogol describes the Kazakh hordes as going quite insane in battle, or, as Ether puts it in 1522, they were drunken with anger, even as a man who is drunken with wine. One unpleasant aspect of the business worthy of mention is the universal custom of scalp collecting, at all times practiced with zeal on the steppes of Asia, as in America. It was actually the custom for Asiatic conquerors at all times to pose as incarnations of the devil. The insane wars of the Jaredite chiefs ended in the complete annihilation of both sides, with the kings the last to go. The same thing had almost happened earlier in the days of Achish, when a civil war between him and his sons reduced the population to 30. That's Ether 9:12. This all seems improbable to us, but two circumstances peculiar to Asiatic warfare explain why the phenomenon is by no means without parallel. One, since every war is strictly a personal contest between kings, the battle must continue until one of the kings falls or is taken. And two, yet things are so arranged that the king must be the very last to fall, the whole army existing for the sole purpose of defeating his person. This is clearly seen in the game of chess, in which all other pieces are expendable, except the king, who can never be taken. The Shah in chess, writes M.E. Moghadam, is not killed and does not die. The game is terminated when the Shah is pressed into a position from which he cannot escape. This is in line with all good traditions of chess playing, and back of it the tradition of capturing the king in war rather than slaying him, whenever that could be accomplished. Yeah, and then you'd go and ransom him, depending on the age you were in. I'm thinking of King John and King Richard of England. You will recall the many instances in the Book of Ether in which kings were kept in prison for many years but not killed. In the code of medieval chivalry, taken over from Central Asia, the person of the king is sacred, and all others must perish in his defense. Sorry, I'm mulling this over. Remember how I had questions last time about if the kings were brought to battle against one another until the very end, at the very end, then how did armies go to their deaths first, and then it became the two-tiered military system that we have modern, where if you are educated, you are an officer, whereas if you're uneducated, you're enlisted. And that came from the knights and nobles being the officer versus the enlisted, where they just go and fight. There's lots of army movies and books about that, like Sharp's Rifle and all this other stuff. Anyway, so interesting. So maybe it is that it was kind of always that the kings fought last, but there are times where kings are right in the front of the battle. I guess it depends on what stage you are at. Because if you are large enough, there's just a huge army and they got to do something. So they all fight. I don't know. It's a mess. After the battle, the victor may do what he will with his rival, and infinitely ingenious tortures were sometimes devised for the final reckoning. But as long as the war went on, the king could not die, for whenever he did die, the war was over, no matter how strong his surviving forces. And this is where you get the idea of cut off the head of the snake kind of tactics. That totally shouldn't have worked. Sorry, I'm quoting from Sahara, which is fantastic. Even so, Shiz was willing to spare all of Coriantumr's subjects if he could only behead Coriantumr with his own sword. In that case, of course, the subjects would become his own. A circle of warriors, large and mighty men, as the strength of men, Ether 1526, that fought around their king, to the last man represent the same ancient institution, the sacred shield wall, which our own Norse ancestors took over from Asia, which meets us again and again in the wars of the tribes, in which one or more than one, on one occasion, the king actually was the last to perish. So let no one think the final chapter of Ether is at all fanciful or overdrawn. Wars of extermination are a standard institution in the history of Asia. Now, he does make a good point. I always sat there and thought, how did this carry on? That it was drawn out to the last person, that they really were the last to die. I thought, that's pretty crazy. I didn't understand how that could be true. But now that he's talking about it, it makes sense. If you are doing actual wars of annihilation and you surround yourself as king because you have this cultural part, and he brings up, chess and all these other instances in history, I'm like, oh, okay, that's makes sense. I have had the thought that I thought that's pretty crazy that they were the last to die, but now I can understand how it would actually happen that way. So it is not fanciful or overdrawn. He's convinced me well. To cite a few examples, when Genghis Khan overcame the great Merkit nation, he left only one man alive, the brother of his favorite wife. Woo! The Assyrian kings would systematically annihilate every living thing in the lands they conquered, sowing fields with salt, like the Romans, and flooding the sites of the cities they destroyed to convert them into uninhabitable wastelands. In cities of 1 million inhabitants, The Mongols left not a dog or a cat alive. And they converted vast provinces into complete deserts. Whew. The great island of Cyprus was uninhabited waste for 7 years after the Turkomans took it. The Goths, in a single battle, entirely exterminated the Skiri, the Jordanes, chapter 53. So Goths as a group of people, not people dressed up in black with spikes. The Huns did the Scythians and Alans, and the Mongols did the Tartans. The Mongols themselves met retribution in 1732 when their own kinsmen, the Manchus, wiped out 9/10 of the Oirat Mongols in a Chinese-inspired project aimed at the complete obliteration of both sides. Oof. Such mutual suicides of nations were not uncommon. The Qin and the Hisa, the two greatest empires of their day, and as closely related in blood as were the people of Shiz and Coriantumr, engaged in 15 years of warfare that wiped out 18 million people. A figure that makes Ether's 2 million, chapter 15, verse 2, look rather paltry. Yeah, it kind of does. I never realized that. I think these are really big numbers, but I had no idea about these other wars and about the absolute obliteration of so many people. Incidentally, the wars of Genghis Khan cost China alone 40 million lives. The Hunnish Zhao dynasty of the north and the Dzin Empire of the south almost achieved mutual quietus during a civil war in which neither side was willing to make peace until the other was completely crushed. In the 1st century BC, the Huns divided to follow two brothers, Gigi and Huhansi, Jiji, that's Gigi, and Huhansi. 20 years of war followed, and the deadlock was only broken when, in 43 BC, Gigi's, I keep saying it with that French accent, Gigi's people, in despair, finally fled west in the best Jaredite manner, leaving vast stretches of land bare and deserted, left behind them. This sort of history should convince the most skeptical that the Book of Ether is not exaggerating in what it tells us, either of what happened or of the scale of events. The whole picture is a conservative one by Asiatic standards, but by the same standards, completely authentic. What the Jaredites left behind was a land littered with bones, for so swift and speedy was the war that the whole face of the land was covered with the bodies of the dead. And a generation later, their bones lay scattered in the land northward. A medieval traveler passing Kiev years after the original wars between the Mongol and Russian hordes reports, "When we were traveling through this country, we found an innumerable multitude of dead men's skulls and bones lying upon the earth. Far away in Komania and Kangel, we found many skulls and bones lying upon the ground like cattle dung. All the living inhabitants," he notes, "were reduced to slavery. Where burial was at all possible after these great battles, the only practical procedure was to heap up bodies in great piles and cover them up with earth, erecting great tumuli over them. The entire Naaman nation was thus buried after its destruction. Joinville, traveling a whole year through Asia to reach the court of the Cham of Tartary, saw all along the road of Tartar conquest large mounds of bones. A careful comparison of the prehistoric mounds of Asia and America is in order, but not very likely for years to come." In fact, I think it's been mostly overlooked. Jeez Louise. This is so foreign to me. It really is. Like, again, you can read it in the Book of Mormon, and you're like, wow, that's crazy. But the idea, the reason I say it's so foreign, even though, oh, you read about it and you have these stories about it, is the fact that there's nothing that viscerally gets it in your bones about how terrible these things were. Like, there's only been a few works of art that sprinkle just enough flavor of war in there to show how horrifically terrible it is. Like, you watch Schindler's List, and you watch Saving Private Ryan, and a few other war movies like that, and you really get a sense of the modern mechanized industrial warfare. But this whole sweep the land, leave the bones behind, and pick through the ruins of life and the destruction afterwards. Like, just for, if you are not part of this wandering horde of destroyers, for the people left behind that see the bodies just rotting in the field. Sorry, I'm going dark here. But there's few things that depict that well. And it's just fascinating to me that this is something that has repeated itself, that it's in several historical books, and that we don't get that concept. Why? Because we've lived a very charmed life. We lived a very blessed life. And those people who have had to live through it because they've had to be the soldiers on the front line or seen things like this, I'm very sorry. And I'm very grateful. And we get to live in a land where we go down the road and we see billboards. We walk down paths that are, oh no, I have a pothole or two, instead of, I can't use a car on this road because it's now bombed out and there's huge giant sinkholes in places, and so travel is now restricted. And if I were to travel from one city to another, there's, as they say, skulls littering the ground like dung. I'm sorry, it's dark, and I don't want to dwell on it for the sake of other people, but to me, in some ways, I'm like, I don't know if it's a morbid fascination or if it's because I need to visualize this to understand how bad it can be, and if I ever come across it, how to not basically break down in horror at the sight. Because it's like, dude, what do you think was going to happen? And I think that's a part of the obsession of trying to visualize how dark things can get, is to basically prepare yourself should it ever occur. If we are truly blessed enough to just live through this wonderful modern age that we live in, like truly wonderful modern age we live in, we've got a crap ton of problems. We do. But frankly, it is delightful and blessed. The worst thing that we have to worry about is kids having their brains drained out through their ears because all they do is watch brain rot, or the idea that we have cultural problems, sure. Well, you could call it moral problems, you could call it brain drain problems, but that's common among every generation. All the older people are like, oh, kids these days, they're stupid, they don't know how to work right, yet they still rise up and take the banner eventually. Yeah, you can worry about kids these days all you want, but they still rise up to fill the shoes of their predecessor at one point or another. So look back on the next generation, shake your cane at them, whip them into shape, and they'll be whipped into shape, just like all the other generations beforehand. So if we can comparatively stay in this land of bliss, we'll be very lucky. Very. The Jaredite survivors. So last section here for this chapter. So this is a question mark, by the way. So instead of the Jaredite survivors, it's Jaredite survivors. The first rule of historical criticism in dealing with the Book of Mormon, or any other ancient text, is never oversimplify. Oh, geez. We have entire channels that are all about oversimplifying. We're screwed! Anyway, for all its simple and straightforward narrative style, this history is packed as few others, with a staggering wealth of detail that completely escapes the casual reader. I agree. The whole Book of Mormon is a condensation. Yeah, condensation. I thought. Sorry. I would think of it as. Well, yeah, condensation, because you're condensing it. The root word of this is condensing things. I'm thinking of condensation as like water condensing. Oh, well, yeah, that works as well. Sorry. So yeah, the whole Book of Mormon is a condensation, and a masterly one. It will take years simply to unravel the thousands of cunning inferences and implications that are wound around its most matter-of-fact statements. Only laziness and vanity lead the student to early conviction that he has the final answers on what the Book of Mormon contains. It is the constitutional disposition of mankind, said Joseph Smith, to set up stakes and set bounds to the works and ways of the Almighty. Yeah, we oversimplify things. Why be so certain that you comprehend the things of God when all things with you are so uncertain? Teachings of the Prophet Smith, compiled by Joseph Fielding Smith. That's where that quote comes from. These words aptly apply equally to the wildest revivalist and ablest scientist. Tertullian taught that anything which is not specifically stated in the Bible to have occurred in the past must actually be assumed not to have happened at all. Really, Tertullian? Really? If it ain't in the Bible, then it didn't really happen? Really? Really? Even the most opinionated Bible student today would not limit himself so strictly. But granted that we may go farther than Tertullian, how far may we go? Nothing in the restored gospel was more offensive to the Christian world than its insistence on going much too far to suit the Christian world, and daring to speak of doctrines and events not mentioned in the Bible at all. Yeah, you guys aren't Christian, says other churches, where we're like, we talk of Christ, we preach of Christ, we teach our children to know who to look for redemption through Christ. We have not just the Book of Mormon as another witness of Christ, it's the best witness of another testament. It's the best testament of Jesus Christ. It's the one that says, not only was he Jesus Christ in the Middle East, he was Jesus Christ for the whole world. He was God with the whole world. And yet they want to call us less Christian. It's ridiculous. Anyways, so yes, it was daring to speak of doctrine and events not mentioned in the Bible at all. For example, Brigham Young states, in the face of long centuries of misinterpretation of Genesis 1:14, how long the starry heavens have been in existence, we cannot say. How long they will continue to be, we cannot say. How long there will be air, water, earth, how long elements will endure in their present combinations, it is not for us to say. Our religion teaches us that there never was a time when they, the physical elements, were not. And there never will be a time when they will cease to be. They are here and will be hereafter. Obviously, the implication of such statements are highly offensive to many good Christians and scientists. 6 months before his death, the prophet Joseph Smith declared, I have tried for a number of years to get the minds of the saints prepared to receive the things of God, but we frequently see some of them, after suffering all they have for the work of God, will fly to pieces like glass as soon as anything comes that is contrary to their traditions. You know, that is so unfortunately true. Look at how much the saints endured, especially in the early times. But apparently even they had people who just, something came up and it was against what God had said, so let's fall to pieces. We suffer the same thing today. How many members of the church will go through their childhood, strengthen their testimony, be willing to go on a mission. Go on a mission. They come home from their mission. They should be well done and strengthened in the church. But then life hits them. Regular life hits them. They're no longer scheduled to go to school, scheduled to do this, scheduled to do that. You literally have your life before you. You make choices. So you bind yourself to some sort of employer to schedule your life out, etc. Find that comforting day-to-day job. But the daily grind comes at you. And the daily scripture study isn't cutting it. Or perhaps they're finally exposed to something that was a sore point for them. Or perhaps their expectations of what they hoped in their life is suddenly not met by something else in their life. Whether that's their job, their spouse, or maybe their girlfriend, or maybe not having one. Or maybe it's, again, members of the church who, they start raising their family, they start down this path, but then it's like, oh, they're handed DNA versus the Book of Mormon, instead of thinking critically about it. Maybe they have lived in a bubble world enough that they fly to pieces like glass. It happens to all of us. All of us. All of us. And I emphasize that. There are times where whatever is your sore spot, it will come back at you. Satan is going to throw his thumb in your eye. He's going to kick you in the knee. He's going to try and take you out wherever you're weakest. He's going to find that, just because it's natural for temptations to arise in every way. And whatever comes, and you start going against what you already know, you're flying to pieces like glass because you feel like, well, it should be this way, when it's like, Just watch. Just take a second. Anyway, sorry. That just hit home to me, because I always thought of the early saints as people who were all, quite stalwart and willing to suffer through everything. But we're seeing the end result of I'm suffering from survivor bias. I'm used to the older saints being, perfectly strong and stalwart and faithful. And it's like, no. Those are the people who stayed. There was a lot of people who turned against the church. In fact, the three witnesses of the Book of Mormon, each in their own turn, left the church. 2 of them came back eventually, and 1 of them stayed away. It's true. Something comes up, whether it's life and expectations, or whether it's doctrine and expectations, and they fly to pieces like glass, instead of taking a pause and trying to figure it out, or stick through it. Anyway, of what traditions is he speaking? Not infant damnation, or baptism by sprinkling, or Neoplatonic ideas about God, for such things the saints had left behind. The traditionalism to which he refers is clear from another address given by the prophet at about the same time, when he said, I suppose I am not all allowed to go into an investigation of anything that is not contained in the Bible. If I do, I think there are so many overwise men here that they will cry treason and put me to death. So I will go to the old Bible and turn commenter today. Hence, later on, I can't remember which prophet it was like, we need to take the Book of Mormon seriously. I wonder if it was still that tradition. Notice that good members of the church are charged with 2 follies. 1, taking the Bible as the only possible source of knowledge, and 2, interpreting the Bible strictly in light of their own limited experience. Yeah, I bet you that tradition kept with the saints for some time. Turning to the Book of Mormon, is it not possible there also to fall into old sectarian vice of oversimplifying? Are there not many Latter-day Saints who will insist that every American of pre-Columbian descent must be a Lamanite, because, forsooth, there were once Nephites and Lamanites, and the Nephites were destroyed? Yet the Book of Mormon itself makes such an interpretation impossible. The Nephites were destroyed, we are told, but it is pertinent to the case of the Jaredites to ask What does the Book of Mormon mean by destroyed? The word is to be taken, as are so many other key words in the book, in its primary and original sense, to unbuild, to separate violently into its constituent parts, to break up the structure. To destroy is to wreck the structure, not to annihilate the parts. Thus, in 1 Nephi 17:31, we read of Israel in Moses' day that according to his word he did destroy them. Oh, yeah. And according to his word he did lead them, bringing them together after they had been destroyed, i.e., scattered and needed a leader. As one generation hath been destroyed among the Jews, according to 2 Nephi 25:9, even so they have been destroyed from generation to generation, according to their iniquities. A complete slaughter of any one generation would, of course, be the end of their history altogether. But that is not what destroyed means. Of the Jews at Jerusalem, Nephi says, 1 Nephi 17:43, I know that the day must shortly come that they must be destroyed, save only a few. Later, after the Messiah hath arisen from the dead, behold, Jerusalem shall be destroyed again. 2 Nephi 25:15. In these two cases, what actually happened was that the Jews were all scattered, save a few only, that remained in the land. The Israelites, upon entering the promised land, we are told, drove out the children of the land, yea, unto the scattering them to destruction. Oh ho ho, see? See 1 Nephi 17:32. Here it is plainly stated that the destruction of the Canaanites was their scattering, as in, known to have been the case likewise of the Nephites. After thy seed shall be destroyed, and dwindle in unbelief, and also the seed of thy brethren, behold, these things shall be hid up. 1 Nephi 13:35. Where both Nephite and Lamanites dwindle in unbelief after they have been destroyed. Only once in the Book of Mormon do we read of a case of annihilation where we are specifically told that every living soul of the Ammonihites was destroyed. That's Alma 16:9. We're not the only social structure, but each individual is undone. In other instances, the Lord promises that he will not utterly destroy the descendants of Lehi's youngest son, Joseph. See 2 Nephi 3:3, or Lemuel. See 4:9. And even Nephi is told that God will not suffer that the Gentiles will utterly destroy the mixture of thy seed which are among thy brethren. 1 Nephi 13:30. Even though the promise and fulfillment were that the Nephites should be destroyed, Ether 8:21, and even though Moroni can say there is none save it be Lamanites, Ether 4:3. So when we read that the Jaredites were destroyed by the hand of the Lord upon the face of this north country, in the very first verse of Ether, we are to understand that the nation was smashed and dispersed, but not that the catastrophic final battle was necessarily the whole story. The first thing that occurs to King Mosiah on the discovery of the 24 gold plates was, perhaps they will give us a knowledge of the remnants of the people who have been destroyed, from whence this record came. Mosiah 8:12, showing that whether anyone survived or not, for Mosiah at least, it was perfectly possible for remnants of a people to exist after that people had been destroyed, but did not Ether prophesy that every soul should be destroyed, save it were only Coriantumr? Ether 13:21. Every soul of what? Specifically of his kingdom, and that all his household. Ether himself, hiding out in a cave, was not included in the number, and neither were other inhabitants of the continent, Nephites and Lamanites, and Mulekites that were actually living here at the time of the Jaredite destruction. Neither were renegades of the kingdom. That there were such renegades will appear from a number of things. And thus he ends it. Next is a permanent heritage, chapter 6. So he makes an extremely good point here at the end, that we as people tend to oversimplify. Well, it says it in the scriptures, and so there it must be, that they were absolutely, utterly annihilated. Okay, so the utter annihilation would probably be of the armies. And yes, it looks extremely desolate. And yes, we get the idea that because of how it is written, sorry, I got to step on something. Because of how it is written, we often sit there and go, well, they were totally and utterly destroyed, like completely down to the last person. And that would be true of his kingdom or of his armies. But it never made any sense to me that they would be absolutely, completely bereft of all life. And so I can tell I had often held both of those things in my mind, but never had them compete. I would hold the idea that, yeah, they were absolutely, totally, utterly destroyed, as well as, yeah, but surely there were some survivors. But they never did compete. And so, in the end, they were utterly destroyed if they were part of that specific army, but there surely would have been survivors around. And I think this is why you get tribal and migratory peoples that just were like, I'm getting out of here. I am not sticking around for the utter obliteration of myself and my family. If they could. Again, they were sweeping forth the land in front of them, like completely and utterly, just sweeping them by. So it would have been tough, but there would have been survivors. And like he mentions, Ether wasn't a part of that. Other roving bands wouldn't have been a part of that. But they would have really been on the outskirts of civilization, or they would have been absorbed into any places that would have taken them, if they would have been taken. So, wow, that life and history is messy, really messy. It's absolutely staggering how much we don't think about. We have it very well. This is what was said to me, and this is how I interpreted it. Instead of critically thinking, we do that a lot. Whether you're smart or not, we do that a lot. Just because we're not experts in all things, and sometimes it takes the outside sources to sit there and say, just a second there, take a pause, take a moment, really think about it. How would this really pan out in all of this? I find it interesting that Hugh Nibley has the idea of it was pan-continental Book of Mormon area for the Jaredites. And I can understand why he would have that. And when he talks about millions of people dying here now, I understand why it's like a lot less of a big deal compared to utter obliterations in the East. Oh man, this is just fascinating. Crazy fascinating stuff. Anyway, my mind is wandering off into battles and wars and after effects and what would it be like. I'm a fan of Studio Ghibli, and there are certain things that are done by Hayao Miyazaki, the main director in Studio Ghibli. There's Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind, which is post-apocalyptic kind of show, where they're living in this valley that's protected because there's a wind that keeps away this toxic jungle, and the toxic jungle arose after basically an equivalency of a nuclear war, and so it's toxic because of all this. It's absorbing all the crap from the war, and so the Valley of the Wind is protected because of the wind, but then wars and politics get involved, and it becomes pretty crazy. And she goes through this land of destruction and bones and jungles and such, and it's fascinating kind of thing. And there are other Castle in the Sky is another one where it's way past whatever apocalypse or danger there was. You have these old mines that are crumbling and in disrepair that they go through, and they were finding this particular mineral, and there was this literal floating island with a castle in the sky, and it's all very beautiful and naturalistic, but it all speaks of this undertone of great power and great destruction. And that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking of. I mean, if you sit there and go to the Land of Desolation, it depends on how fast you came into the Land of Desolation after these wars of destruction, where, if it was like immediately after the battles, it would be nasty, because everyone would still be basically rotting out in the fields. On the other hand, if you come years after, even just a year or two after, and let's say all the scavengers had their way with any decomposing that needed to happen, then the bones are just lying on the surface. It would be very disquieting. It would be that same kind of something's not right here, but it would be a lot more pastoral, a lot more like something happened big, and here we see the results of it, but what happened? Be a huge, crazy mystery. It's just fascinating. And so that's where my mind wanders in all this. There's so much to just absorb because we don't live this life here. We don't. And in fact, in a lot of modern warfare, still even then, it's quite different. We have destructions of buildings and other things like that. It's just, wow. The difference between during the destruction and when you come afterwards. You find these ruins and you can regrow from them. Anyway, this is going to be captivating my imagination as much as I can until I have to go to work and live life. And anyways, take time to enjoy the pleasantness of your life that is afforded to you by the fact that God has given us good commandments that help us as a civilization to work together. That we can look at our neighbor and assume the best about them, that we all try to be honest and kind and helpful. That we can trust one another in all these simple things that we literally take for granted every day. How we drive on our roads, how we operate in our schools, how we work together knowing that, yeah, we'll be paid even if it's all digital electronically, that we can trust each other because of these basic commandments, so fundamentally basic commandments that allow for civilization to happen, and that we live a life of ease and pleasantness, despite all the troubles morally, mentally, and spiritually that we need to endure, and even physically at times. We have all of this, and how fragile it can be, that if we break down one of the most fundamental things of being honest, or the most fundamental things of you don't cause violence to your neighbor, how quickly it can descend into these kind of things. Be grateful, and teach all people everywhere, especially if they're starting to lose a grip on what they choose about the commandments, especially ones of being violent and seeing the best in other people. Teach them the better way so we do not descend into the living torture of warfare in our homeland. And I pray anyone who is going through war, may God truly be with you, and may you find peace and solace in him.